weird, but it is exciting to have this in-person gathering to celebrate the work of IJURR, but also to get a chance to have all the members of IJURR and the editors here to discuss the issue of critical urban scholarship and its decentering. My name is Hyunbang Shin, one of the editors of IJURR and also director of the center called Sosi-Hope Southeast Asia Center, which is the joint organizer of this event. Before I go further into it, let me first thank my center manager, Katie, who has done tremendous wonderful job to help and organize today's event, and our two assistants who have recently joined us. So let me thank them as a start. Let me also thank all the attendees who are here in person as well as on Zoom space. We had about 400 people registering for today's event. So some people might still be arriving at Zoom. It's truly a global registration. These are the locations of where people are based and who have registered for this event today. So you can see all the way from Asia to Africa, South America, North America, and so on. So we have truly a global presence, although not everyone might be here, but it is really exciting to have this event. As the director of the center, I won't say too much, but just to welcome you, but also to say very briefly, today's discussion to talk about decentering critical urban scholarship conversations with IJURR is really to bring us together to discuss not only the importance of critical urban scholarship in this age, where I think the critical understanding of urban affairs becomes ever more important given what's happening across the world. Also to indicate, share that IJURR over the years has been working really hard to have better representation of scholars in the global South, and also diversify our understanding to promote this critical urban scholarship. Our board members have been more diversified to have greater representation of those who are in the global South, gender-wise, and also ethnicity-wise, also more having greater diversity. Our papers are seeing more presence of authors and submissions coming more from global South, notably Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, as well as Middle East, Africa, South America. But admittedly, there are more work to be done even in IJURR space. So we still do have more papers which are published, which are by authors from Western Europe and North America. Much fewer papers, relatively speaking, from other parts of the global, the parts of the global South. So there are more work to be done, and this is really a moment, and for us to think about collectively what it means to talk about critical urban scholarship, and also for our speakers who are members of the editorial board, to share with us initially their thoughts about what critical urban scholarship means for them in their work and also in their region. And I hope the whole discussions with the panel members and during the Q&A with the audience and Zoom attendees will give us a chance to think about this in a collective manner and leave the venue and event today with a bit more forward-looking ideas about what needs to be done. So I won't introduce all the speakers. These speakers will be introduced when we have each panel session. So without further ado, let me hand over to our chair for the first panel session, Liza, another editor of IJURR, and the floor is yours. Over to you.
So I invite the first panel up to join me at the table. All right. It is my pleasure, thank you for the introduction, June, and it is my pleasure to introduce the first of two exciting panels here today and to moderate a discussion on practicing critical urban scholarship. So we are practicing, and I'm joined by three scholar practitioners who will speak from their own work, but particularly each of whom are situated within collaborative networks and research centers that are interdisciplinary, intersectoral, and really help us think through how critical urban scholarship can intersect with practice, critical urban practices. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists all at once, and then we'll go in the order that's on the program. And I will be a timekeeper, and hopefully everyone keeps to about 15 minutes. If we can try to keep to 15 minutes to leave time for discussion. So you'll start to see some flagging as we get close to that, because we want to bring as much of the audience and of the participants in the room, and hopefully as well on Zoom, into the discussion as we can. So our first presenter, Tuna Tashankok, is a professor of urban governance and planning at University of Amsterdam. She is an urban planner and social geographer who has worked in several top-ranking academic institutions and is actively involved in wide-reaching international research networks. Her work analyzes urban transformations from multiple geographical and spatial perspectives, embracing urban governance, property-led urban development dynamics, and spatial regulation through social relations. She is the founder and chair of IJURR, is that how you pronounce it, IJURR? Urban Governance Research Network, which is an interdisciplinary academic platform which aims to contribute to urban governance studies by establishing strong and long-lasting relationships and innovative insights between researchers and practitioners. She is completing a book currently on urban property markets and property regulation, spatial governance landscapes, commissioned by Tourledge Publishers Region and Cities series. She is also the chair of the IJURR Foundation. So after following Tuna's presentation, we'll hear next from Claire. Claire Mercer is professor of human geography in the Department of Geography and Environment here at the LSE. Her current research examines the relationship between property and socio-spatial change in urban Africa. She is completing a book project exploring the significance of property to middle-class reproduction in suburban Dar es Salaam. She is also working on a new 3-year ESRC-funded project examining how self-build housing generates the urban economy and drives neighborhood change in Ghana and Tanzania. And I also have to say she is the editor of the newly hot off the virtual press Spotlight on Africa's Urban Futures, which went live yesterday. And then finally, we will hear from Majo Alvarez, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. She studies social inequality using mixed methods. She is the author of Squatters and the Politics of Marginality, which came out in 2017 from Springer, about the political history of the informal city in Montevideo. She has also worked and published on residential segregation, popular neighborhoods and urban interventions, social housing, tolerance to inequality, middle classes, gated communities, and more recently on interclass relations in college. After more working class students entered higher education with a condonable loan scholarship program in Colombia from 2015. That dramatically changed the class composition of elite colleges and students' social mobility experiences and the visible and invisible barriers they face. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panel, beginning first with Tuna. I'll take my seat over there. This will be my presentation. And don't forget to look this way periodically so you can see my face.
Okay, I prepared for 20 minutes, so it's gonna be needed. All right. Okay, let's.
Then I'll be able to not too
But I'm still having the same problem with leading to comment. Yeah, I do press it, but somehow it doesn't.
Yeah, I see that you're pressing it.
Yeah.
You can try going to slideshow at the top.
Yeah, maybe if you go in that way.
If you go to slideshow, go to slideshow. And then click, oh, it's got use presenter.
Yeah. Then I don't know. Yeah, I do. We had the problem in the beginning and she corrected it. Now it's again the same problem.
Very strange because you can see this. It's very big PDF. I think it's fine to see the preview of the slides to come.
Yeah.
I think they're large enough, you know, the.
Yeah, but there is a whole show with it.
Oh, the show.
No, I switched it off. Yes. All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, then I'll go straight because I lost a couple of minutes.
I
from
haven't
this.
started, I've restarted.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk about practicing critical scholarship through relational approaches, and I will go directly into what I mean by that. But before that, I wanna make it clear what I understand from critical scholarship. To me, critical scholarship is not about re-narrating the existing discourses. To me, it's about searching for answers, alternative approaches for understanding the reality, and also developing new methodologies through constant reflection and revision. And more than that, I think this kind of reflection requires certain abilities. It requires the ability to think out of the box. It requires the ability to collect undiscovered evidence, provide new and alternative lenses to read the reality, and I think most importantly, to be inclusive and also empathetic to the developments. More than that, I think, with critical scholarship, we also have another mission, and this mission is to understand the emergent forms of uneven geographical development, with Neil Brenner's words, and that also, in his words, required this kind of theoretical reflection, methodological experimentation, and concrete research. Okay. We also, as critical scholarship, we went through several turns, I think, which invited us to think beyond several things. One was about thinking beyond the cultural turn and freeing ourselves of the disciplinary biases, which we see a lot in the critical scholarship. Another one is about thinking beyond space, by reflecting on radical and critical geographies and trying to change them, not only understand them, but change them through the melding of theory and political action. And that's why activism becomes one of the important topics in critical scholarship. There have been a couple of editorials in IJURR actually talking about the critical scholarship beyond urban planning. I find this one particularly interesting. 2002 tells us that actually urban planning kind of isolates urban studies from current debates of social sciences. And talking about biases, I think this was quite an interesting shift to isolate planning and see it as a kind of practice that prevents us from critical thinking. And then a couple of years later, inviting us back to consider normative concerns and methodological diligence. Keeping this in mind, I think my approach to critical scholarship is not only to understand the change, but understand the uneven development, but also change it through these characteristics that I could see: thinking beyond disciplinary biases, connecting theory and action, and balancing normative concerns and methodological efforts. That also, I think, requires, and in the words of Kingflow, questioning of dominant systems of knowledge production, and the opening up of a dialogue concerned with critical awareness. And from this note, this kind of constructive note, I would like us to think of the dialogues in critical scholarship to understand realities through relational approaches to see what shapes the city. And I'm going to share a little bit of my work in the background to share with you how I actually practice that. And this has been, of course, in the agenda for a while now to see the city as an investment portfolio. My work is in between planning, regulation, research, and property market research. I try to link them. And of course, there have been many scholars doing that. Financialization literature looks at how actually state becomes the tool of financialization and actively facilitates, pushes, and engages with financial activities. And this kind of state engagement brings the local governments into a place where they have to deal with the property markets directly. In the words of Rachel Weber, this, of course, also makes us connected to property being a spatially embedded commodity. So what it means that through property, our work, our cities, developing cities, making cities work is very much dependent on the market forces. There are also complex interdependencies to understand, again, Neil's words, this kind of relational embeddedness and shifting positionality to understand these patterned and regularized interdependencies. In that respect, we can also abstract ourselves and think what shapes actually the city between market and regulation. On the one hand, from the regulation side, we see all kinds of rules and regulations and law and authority. On the market side, we see lots of perceptions of opportunistic behavior, profit-driven behavior, negotiation behavior, and so on. There are lots of perceptions when it comes to look at how the city is being shaped between these forces. However, there is also an increasing dissatisfaction in the scholarly literature about this way of criticizing the property markets. Scholars call it one-dimensional, inviting us to look different dimensions of property development, that we know very little about property industry, that we are not aware of their actions, and then we fail to acknowledge the diversity that exists, and we create all kinds of stereotypes about their behavior. And so this leads to a kind of dissatisfaction. There are also emerging approaches that try to look to property markets in their relation to regulation and relational approach and sense by seeing market as a social construct. If we see market as a social construct, we can also look at the market as a social production process in which we are all part of it. We as citizens, as communities, as regulation makers, public actors, but also property actors with different motifs, different behavior, different modus operandi. Some calls it relational regulation because we cannot separate actually regulation from the market activity. Some invites us to look at the plurality of relationships, but regardless, what is very important is to develop these new relational understandings of the markets. Well, recently in a newly completed research project, together with Mike Rackle, Patrick Legales, and myself, we looked at Paris, London, and Amsterdam to see actually what shapes the residential investment landscapes through this kind of planning regulation. To develop a kind of understanding that relational conceptualization of crisis is very important if we focus on actor landscapes through multidimensional characteristics. In other words, trying to understand what shapes these crises, what shapes these market activity conditions through the multidimensional characteristics of the market actors, which are actually embedded in wider economic and regulatory structures. So again, we cannot separate them from that kind of wider networks. And in that way, we can also abstract and look at projects in the city through this way. You have public sector actors, you have private sector actors, you have communities who have different kinds of institutional relations with each other. Contractual relations, financial relations, informal and formal relations. In that way, you can see every single property development project as a kind of packet of micro-regulation practices, which happens in every single project in a different way, kind of shaping the city between this shift, between this relationship between regulation and market conditions, but not happening at the same time, not happening synchronously. It's all happening in different time frames, in different ways, shaping the city. We can also illustrate it in reality by looking at the residential development projects in Amsterdam, those tiny little dots that you see on the map. They stand for every project which is ongoing or completed in Amsterdam. Of course, it's a compact city. There are about 900 projects. And if we see every project as a packet of micro-regulation practices, we could see that the city is shaped by these practices in very different ways, in very different time frames and understandings of regulation, making it a very complex landscape to understand. And if it's so difficult to understand, how are we going to plan for it? So what we did in our work, we looked at changing public regulations on the one hand and changing property actor landscapes on the other, making also kind of analysis separated but in relation to each other to come to a kind of conclusion that at the regulation side, we see increasing flexibility, regulatory fragmentation, and reflexive governance. And on the side of the market, we see increasing diversity and blurred boundaries of roles. And this goes for public as well as private sector actors. In a recent publication, I invited scholars to read the city through these relational understandings, seeing it as a very dynamic landscape. And it's not a static landscape, it's a very dynamic landscape that we cannot regulate with very static administrative tools. So how do we read regulations? We looked into the regulations that shape the Amsterdam's housing market, because believe it or not, we also have our own share of unevenness in this country. We have affordable housing crisis at this moment, and the government and different levels of government have been issuing regulations in order to shape the housing markets. And here you see national regulations, provincial, municipal, and metropolitan region regulations popping up in different time frames at different cabinets. Those are on the top, different political cabinets. What is very interesting in this figure is that you can see after 2008-9 financial crisis period, you see more regulation activity, but mainly by municipalities and metropolitan region, while the state is kind of quiet because they have been busy with something else I'm going to show you in a minute. But the municipality is almost like trying to catch up with the market speed and market conditions. And what is very interesting here is this figure, which you cannot read, but I'll tell you what it is. These are the investment volumes on different sectors. And what you can see, it's on the time frame. When the crisis hit, the investment volumes went down. And then after 2014, because there was new regulations, they doubled. When there were more investment volumes, there are also more regulations to deal with. Dutch state has been very actively inviting institutional investors to come and invest in the Netherlands, promising, especially after the 2008 crisis, simplifying regulations for special projects, making it easier to start up projects, issuing these two laws. One is Crisis and Recovery Act, and the other one is the Environment and Planning Act, which is still not there, but mainly targeting less rules, and more space for initiatives, in their own words. So space shows this very relaxed attitude, inviting attitude, very entrepreneurial. And now we are reading the investors, and I'm going to do it very fast. We look at the investor behavior, how actually when crisis hit a property market, how it shapes the market and redistributes the behavior of actors. We were really obsessed, literally, with understanding the investor behavior. And for that, we developed a kind of model to understand the profile of property investors through these different characteristics that we developed. You don't need to understand all these, I'll explain you. To see that, for example, in the simple map, you see the metropolitan region and the residential investments just before the crisis, almost balanced domestic and international investments. These are the volumes. You see the crisis period just before the first regulation from the state is issued to invite more international investors, and look at the impact. It's not only that there is more international investments, the black dots, but they are also outside of Amsterdam, because what was happening in the city of Amsterdam at that period, they were constantly issuing very strict regulations to regulate the market. And of course, investors were escaping to the suburban communities, which was easier to develop. What is also very interesting here is to see who these investors were. And these are, again, quantitative figures, but what it shows that before the crisis, it was developer owners. It's a kind of category that shows they were more like domestic, development-oriented actors, very opportunistic actors, because developers are more opportunistic than less calculative, let's say, than investors. And right after the Crisis and Recovery Act, you see investor managers start buying international, and who is selling? Developer owners. So in other words, the market is changing from the hands of the local development actors to the hands of institutional international companies. And here, well, there's something wrong with that figure, but I will just move on quickly. What these figures actually tell us that there is a behavior that comes with the type of the investor that comes to the city. Here in this figure, we also studied those international actors who went to the suburban communities and small cities around Amsterdam to invest over and over again, showing again a tendency. And in the background, the metropolitan region, which doesn't have a real authority, tries to shape this kind of activity through different activities. This also requires us to read new interdependencies, as I was referring earlier. So metropolitan region, who doesn't actually have an authority, official authority, because it's a voluntary partnership, it tries to put some regulations. Another interdependency, Holland Metropole, it's a kind of platform between 5 municipalities, local investors and developers and other market actors representing Dutch state in real estate fairs. And then you have other kind of platforms doing that, knowledge networks doing that, basically shaping the reality between the markets. I'm coming to the last slides. So my work on relational reading of dynamic landscapes of residential property production shows that investors spread through the region more than ever, thanks to this kind of very inviting entrepreneurial, flexible regulations. There are different types of investors shaping the city now. We need to understand them. Of course, while doing that, we need to stay critical. So we also need to understand how they develop new tools, because investors now develop deal teams to negotiate with municipalities by learning how the municipalities actually negotiate. While municipalities or in the public sector side, we see power shifts between national and local government. We see emerging interdependencies, as I'll show you briefly. And we see relaxing national regulations, stricter local regulations in order to shape, regulate, and stimulate the market. We claim that this is a kind of fragmented governance architecture that shapes the city today, which is very difficult to follow. So coming to my last slide, what I'm inviting us is to have the dialogue within the practice of different disciplines to, first of all, go beyond disciplinary biases. Yes, maybe urban planning was very limited in terms of theory some 10, 15 years ago, but I think we need to have new readings of disciplines like urban planning to understand that we can actually use this kind of approaches that links the reality to theory. And linking theory to action, I think that's also a very important aspect here, because again, with reference to literature, we need to understand the complex interdependence of local neoliberalisms and balance normative concerns and methodological efforts with in my opinion, by establishing links between different disciplinary work. I think I will stop here. I hope I didn't extend it too long. Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Katie. I can just use this. Hi everyone, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm not going to be as polished as Tuna. I'm just going to give you some reflections on the theme that we've been asked to talk to about practicing critical urban scholarship. And I want to start by reflecting directly on the theme about this question of decentering critical urban scholarship. Because I'm anxious about being asked to speak to this. You know, I'm a white woman in a UK university. I research and write about Africa. Doesn't mean I don't think we shouldn't be thinking about and trying to decenter ourselves. But I'm anxious about my role. I'm anxious about our role as scholars based here in London. I'm anxious about IJURR's role as a kind of you know, a place in which people are trying to publish their work. So I think one thing that we do need some more of is scholarship about urban Africa authored by Africans. Obviously, I'm writing it on and about Africa. And that also means that that scholarship has to be read and engaged with, regardless of where it's published. There's plenty that's being produced, actually. It's not just a question of making more space for African research in journals like IJURR, although that is important. It's not just about inclusion, but it's also about reading practices. And that's something that I want to say something about a little bit further on. I also want to draw your attention to something that's exciting that Liza mentioned in her opening comments. This is IJURR's new spotlight on Africa's urban futures, which features 6 short essays from scholars across the continent, thinking about what are some of the important dynamics that are going to be shaping Africa's futures in the coming years. So I highly recommend you have a look at that if you are interested. But I want to kind of think a little bit more about and reflect on this prompt about practicing critical urban scholarship based on my own work. And as Liza said, I am engaged in this multi-country, multi-researcher research project at the moment, but I'm actually going to talk about my own work because of the pandemic. Basically, we haven't done very much in that in that group project yet. So I want to say a little bit about my own work on middle class reproduction on the suburban frontier in Dar es Salaam. And I start with this image. This is a typical landscape on the suburban frontier in northern Kinondoni in the north of Dar es Salaam in Wazo ward. It's about 20 kilometers north of the city centre. This land where this self-built bungalow has been constructed was farmland until the turn of the 21st century. And as recently as the 1990s, the city's northern hinterland around this area was sparsely populated by a patchwork of extensive farms owned by indigenous Zaramo, who tended cashew and coconut trees. There were a few smaller and medium-sized farms interspersed growing fruit and vegetables for local markets. So it was mostly this indigenous shifting cultivation group. Two decades later, the transformation of this hinterland into a low-density, desirable residential neighbourhood was well underway. Urbanites were seeking affordable land on which to build the house to which they aspired. This is kind of ordinary middle-class suburban life. It's centred on so many unremarkable dwellings that seem to embody a global suburban ideal, close enough to the city to benefit from the city's economic and social life, far enough not to have to deal with the everyday hubbub and the hassle. These suburban neighbourhoods do seem to have much in common with a globalised suburban model. But they're also distinctive in significant ways, and perhaps most importantly, they're being developed through the repetition of thousands of individual cash-based domestic building projects, rather than through large-scale financialised property development. So the long history of land use and settlement that precedes the more recent self-building boom has given rise to a socially and spatially mixed heterogeneous suburban zone. Much of it lacks tarmac roads, stormwater drainage, as you can see, sanitation and running water. And these are in fact mostly informal settlements, but not as they've been commonly represented in cities of the global south. Most residents, they may lack formal legal titles to the land they occupy, but that hasn't stopped them from investing in their property, from making substantial investments. It's not uncommon to walk down past coconut trees to find a house that may be even more opulent than these that you can see here. Kind of two-storey house, smartly painted in a pastel colour, roofed with the most up-to-date imported aluminium roofing sheets, just visible behind an elaborately decorated concrete wall topped with shards of broken glass. And in the wider project that I've been working on over the last 10 years, I've been trying to think about how the middle classes have increasingly congregated at and transformed the city's edge. So it's a project thinking about the middle class in formation. And what I've been interested in is both land acquisition for house building, domestic architecture, what these buildings look like, their style, their aesthetics, landscape change, and new lifestyle practices associated with suburban space. And my main reflection has to do with how we represent space as scholars of urban areas. So thinking about the urban, the regional, and what doesn't translate. So if you look across urban studies, the new urban forms that are taking shape on African urban peripheries, the new urban forms that are taking shape on African urban peripheries, they do tend to defy easy characterization. Recent work in urban studies has generated productive ways of thinking about the dynamics of urban expansion in cities of the global south. I'm thinking about insurgent urbanism, incremental change. There's work that talks about peripheral, plotting, piecemeal, extensive and massive urbanization. Yet none of these characterizations fully captures the dynamics that have shaped Dar es Salaam's urban periphery. It's a space that doesn't fit existing urban studies theoretical views about this kind of space. It's not the suburb of urban theory because it has this mixed population and spontaneous land use. Also in recent years, we have more research on investment across Africa in high-end urban real estate and satellite cities, fueled by international and elite capital. But the actors And the instruments involved in these developments that I'm interested in are very different. They're small scale, they're cash-based transactions, they're shaping vernacular land markets, and this is how the majority of urban populations in many African cities actually access land and build housing across the continent. So to try and grasp these processes, I'm very much inspired by Tariq's work in trying to get us to, and also my colleague Austin Zeiderman, in trying to get us to think beyond the enclave of urban theory, beyond the kind of self-referential texts that set out to study the urban. And so I have engaged with urban studies and geography and anthropology that's explored the significance of land as a key driver of urban dynamics. But I've also gone beyond the canon of urban studies. I've looked at works of African urban colonial history and work on land in Africa, the vast majority of which is not about urban land. It's mostly concerned with rural land and agrarian change. And this work I found super productive. It draws attention to the political economic dimensions of land, to the specific mechanisms of dispossession, enclosure and commodification, to the enduring colonial legacies on land tenure, recent attempts at land reform, and to the relationship between property and authority and the consequences of all of this for understanding social differentiation and class formation. And this work helps me to see that colonial urban planning, however patchy and incomplete, enframed African cities. And I'm using enframing from Timothy Mitchell's work about the British in Cairo. And it left its imprint not only on the city's material form, but also on how people thought about urban space and their place in it. And you see that imprint lingering in the built environment and the visceral experience of the city's landscapes. Now, the colonial is not the only logic of the production of urban space, but it does remain as a kind of spatial residue of the coloniality of power. It endures in colonial land tenure regimes that render the majority of urban residents as squatters without access to decent housing. It endures in residents' ideas about the aesthetics of good urban space in terms of topography, planning, and architecture. And it endures in a hierarchical way of thinking about urban space, in which some places are better than others, and people higher up the social hierarchy deserve to live in better places. And as I show in this project, it endures in middle-class urban imaginaries and urban spatial practices. In Tanzania, popular representations of urban space are saturated with this colonial residue. The tripartite colonial enframing of Dar es Salaam during the colonial period divided the city into 3 zones distinguished by building regulations, which you may be able to work out here. If you can see zone 1 down in the center, zone 2 is the Indian area, and then zone 3 kind of, you can see the kind of more laid out colonial urban suburban areas to the north. So the colonial enframing divides the city into 3 zones, and it's distinguished by building regulations. Obviously, there are now more localized terms to refer to specific neighborhoods, yet what has struck me in talking to people about space in Dar es Salaam is this colonial enframing nevertheless persists, and it's pervasive as a typology of urban space that's used to refer to upscale planned neighbourhoods, which is the Uzunguni, the zone 1, commercial districts historically dominated by the Indian community, which is zone 2, or Uhindini, and unplanned and unserviced neighbourhoods containing poor quality, densely built, self-built housing, Uswahilini, or zone 3. And this framing is regularly deployed in everyday life in cities across the country. And as I explore in one of the chapters of the book that this project is slowly moving towards, these newly constructed suburban landscapes of the urban periphery, they don't quite fit this tripartite designation of the city. They may be more desirable residential neighbourhoods, but they don't approximate Uzunguni, the original suburbs built and serviced for Europeans by the colonial state. And they're not like Uswahilini either, because they're lower density, they've got higher quality buildings that you see on the suburban periphery. And in fact, what's really interesting when you talk to people who've built the houses that you see in some of these images is the fear of Uswahilini, the fear that these new suburban areas might eventually degenerate into Uswahilini type zones. And that drives middle class residents to seek land further out where they're going to build again. And in the process, they push what I call the suburban frontier further outward. How much longer do I have, Liza? 4 minutes. Okay, so I'll just very briefly tell you about the suburban frontier. So in the book, I develop the concept of the suburban frontier, trying to sidestep some of the problems with suburb in urban theory, but also to rethink it to capture some of the dynamics that I've talked to you about. And I think about it as a zone of commodification, of dispossession, of accumulation, of risk, of aspiration and experimentation. And all of those things are especially productive for middle class reproduction. The middle classes have been the principal beneficiaries of the commodification of land and the enclosure of plots on the suburban frontier. They've accumulated assets in the form of land that can be built on. They've loaned or sold land. Their houses can be rented out. Yet their property is also at risk in this suburban grey zone, where the statutory land tenure of the city bleeds into the customary land tenure that prevails in the formerly rural hinterland. So middle class experience on the suburban frontier is shaped by these twin possibilities for accumulation and loss. And property is always open to contestation from neighbours or strangers, or reclamation by the state under eminent domain. But in addition to these points about the political economy of land, the concept of the suburban frontier also tries to capture the politics of aesthetics at work here, of the work that the imaginaries of Uzunguni and Uswahilini do to drive how people make urban space. So the suburban frontier is also a zone where the middle classes seek to consolidate their social position through building distinctive domestic architecture and forming distinctive suburban landscapes. And in building desirable residential space, they've pushed into the city's rural hinterland. The middle classes have transformed this landscape from the scattered farms that I started out with into a sea of kind of small-scale, self-built houses on individual plots. And the relative size and the quality and the design of these buildings, the building materials they use, has produced a desirable suburban landscape when compared to the congested inner city neighbourhoods and the scattered poorer quality housing of the peri-urban fringe that lies beyond them. The suburban frontier is also a social and cultural frontier, where the new middle classes are pioneering suburban lifestyles around privatised leisure, transport and social services and consumption practices. And so overall, what I argue in this project is that starting in the last third of the 19th century, land was enclosed, it was alienated, it was later nationalised, it was enclosed again and became commodified, as it was claimed across that time period by Arab and European investors, and then colonial and then post-colonial governments and farmers, and now these urban residents. So that by the 2000s, most of the remaining original indigenous farmers, the Zaramo, they've been dispossessed through hundreds of individualized informal market transactions. And in their place, we have this mosaic of the lower, upper middle classes, the urban poor in the interstitial spots that's transformed this formerly rural hinterland into a residential suburban frontier. And by the mid-2010s, when I started doing my fieldwork, land prices were climbing ever higher. Savvy suburban residents were anticipating where the next suburban frontier might develop beyond places like these where I've been doing my fieldwork. And they were already busy buying land further out. And in so doing, the suburban frontier will most likely move with them. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire and Martha. Last panel, please.
Well, many connections with what both of you said. So you said, and we were talking with Claire before, and I was like, well, this is very difficult to answer because I don't even know if I'm really a critical scholar or whatever. But so this is not a regular presentation of findings, and it made all of us, I think about our practice, and for me that was an interesting experience. So I come from sociology. I study inequalities. I'm particularly interested in segregation and in the role of networks across social classes to reproduce or change inequality. I do mixed methods, and I work on Latin America, mainly in Montevideo, where I'm from, and Bogota, where I work and been living for the last 15 years or 14 years. So I really started to ask myself if I was a critical scholar. And so I was like, well, what is the consensus about critical urban scholarship, and what do I do, and what are the differences? So on the left side is what the consensus about critical scholarship lays. And so the first thing is go against common sense, which was what Tuna started talking about. And I think, yes, totally, I try to do that, including being critical of the critical of critical theorists, critical all the time. And especially consider what people think about the things we are critical about. So when in one of my projects with a group of scholars from UCL, we were studying cable cars in Medellin and in other cities in Colombia. And from our critical perspectives, we were like, these people need water, need light, need food, need money. They don't need a cable car. So we go there and they were, and this is to exoticize the poor. And the people were like, we love that people now come and see us. We love the cable car. We really like it. And that was totally against our common sense as critical researchers. And I think for being really critical, we need to listen to what they think. In another project about building middle classes, but from social housing, mostly lower middle classes through social housing. Again, this is peripheral social housing in Colombia, in Bogota. You see the rural frontier there. From an urbanist point of view, this is the worst. This is very far away of where people work. This is very far away from good schools, very far away from many services, and the apartments are very small. Again, people have a very high satisfaction with those houses. And that was against our original critical theorist orientation. And the point is that to be really critical, we need to be critical about our own prejudices or knowledge as researchers. Second, another thing that is very important for critical theory is that it criticizes existent inequalities, the study of inequalities. And yes, I try to do that all the time in my work. And inequality is not only the poor, but also studying the middle classes and the rich and the mechanisms that produce, reproduce, and reduce inequalities. So I've tried to do most of it in my research, studying first gated communities. That was my master's thesis. And this is in Montevideo, but it's Live What You Dream About, private neighborhood bio-intelligent. That's a new one. I don't know what that is, but this neighborhood is bio-intelligent. And we can see this in many cities in the world. And it's very important, I think, to understand why this is happening. At the same time, it's very important to not exoticize these spaces and see that many people that live in central London are as segregated as people in gated communities, and kind of question that common sense of critical theory. Then I went to the other side of the distribution and wrote my book on squatters and the history the political history of land squatting in Montevideo, Uruguay, trying to see how they got to the state, they related to the state, mainly organizing and through clientelistic networks. So that's the story I tell in that book. And I already talked about studying the housing of the middle classes in the context of Colombia through social housing. Another characteristic of critical theory is not only to study inequalities, but think about possibilities, think about alternatives, what Brenner calls emancipatory alternatives. And I also like Eric Olin Wright's idea of real utopias. So try to find these real utopias in terms of cities, cases, social policies that lower inequalities and are good examples of how the futures or other futures could be. And in that sense, I am currently with a group of students and colleagues studying this new policy of the alcaldía, of the local government of Bogota, called blocks of care. It's a policy, it's a feminist policy that dignifies peripheries with activities for not care workers, for caregivers. So mainly women that take care of kids, women that take care of the elderly, women that take care of disabled people. And what they do is they bring them to some services they're all located in peripheral areas. And there it's like a time bank. They can free some time for themselves. So there are washing machines where they can take their clothes to wash. And while someone is washing the clothes for them, and women spend almost 6 to 8 hours a week washing clothes in Colombia on average. So imagine the poor women. And they chat, or they do gym, or they take classes. And while they do that, if they have infant kids, they take care of the kids in these rooms. I didn't take pictures of the kids because you cannot, but in very high quality places where they feel their kids are safe. So this is for me an emancipatory alternative, or a real utopia that I'm trying to understand and also help the local government make this policy visible, so others may support it and take the idea of this real utopia. I like this phrase by Peter Marcuse about what critical is, relating to finding emancipatory alternatives. And he said, critical I take to be, among other things, shorthand for an evaluative attitude towards reality, a questioning rather than an acceptance of the world as it is, a taking apart and examining and attempting to understand the world. It leads to a position not only necessarily critical in the sense of negative criticism, but also critically exposing the positive and the possibilities of change, implying positions on what is wrong and needing change, but also on what is desirable and needs to be built on, and fostered. Another characteristic of critical theory is an old discussion between positivistic and positivistic scholarship and critical theory, or context-based theory. I think we can overcome that stage. And sometimes we need a little bit of positivism, or critical positivism is in need. When Claire was speaking, I was like, this is what we found in Colombia with the middle classes. This is similar to Uruguay. I don't know if there are laws, but at least we can say safely that there are very interesting empirical regularities, and we need more comparative work to find out in what conditions or under what conditions do the middle classes try to separate themselves from the rich or from the poor, or other regularities that we can find, right? So for me, we need more data, we need more comparative data, and we need to get out of our cases. In my office, I have this sign, in God we trust, all others must bring data. Even when data, and I'll add this, but I thought thinking about this presentation, even when data doesn't fit our critical claims. Then another characteristic of critical theory is to be anti-technocratic. And I doubt about this. I have a question mark there. It depends. In Latin America, and I think in the third world, we are all the time tempted, called to help in public policy, or we want to, because mainly welfare politics is on the hands of the economists. And as social scientists, we have a different perspective, and I think it's a challenge to get there. So to become technocrats for the first time, we were never technocrats, really. So why are we fighting with the technocrats if we were never there? We have to change the discourse. We have to work in the public discourse. We have to be heard about how public policies could work and could improve, from urban planning, from sociology, from anthropology, from architecture. So I think we have a role there to diversify the discussions about welfare in technocracy. And this has to do with getting out, or not only publishing papers, but publishing policy work, going to the radio, of course, to speak about what we know, not about everything, as many people do, but we have a public there, right? For instance, I did this work about residential segregation in Uruguay for UNDP, and I got the Ministry of Housing, who didn't read it, and the mayor of Montevideo, who did read it, speaking about my work. And if any seed that social housing out in the peripheries is bad, or any seed about whatever, I talked about renting policies as social housing. If something of that gets into their policy, I would be very proud. And I think that's part of being critical. Of course, working with activists as well, but not only. I think working with governments and trying to make our research heard and read is very, very important. Then things that I believe are part of my critical scholarship, but were not in the readings of any of the critical theorists and scholars that I read to prepare this presentation, is one is more in, when we read about what critical theory or critical urban theory is, we have some papers on what's critical about critical theory, that's Neil Brenner's, or what's urban about it, that's Ananya Roy's. But my question is, where is written and who writes it? And I think it's very important that we diversify the places, as Claire was saying, and that's not easy to do, because we talk about it a lot in the board. It's not only to receive more papers from, say, Asia or Latin America, it's that they get rejected many times because they don't frame the research the way that international journals ask for it. So there's a loss in translation problem that we need to face. And really that takes a lot of care work. It takes a lot of work, tutoring, mentoring, helping to write, but it also takes from the other side to get used to other ways of writing. And we never think about that part. So my being critical as a scholar has to do with making inequalities and hierarchies in knowledge production and publication visible, on make research in the South or from the South visible through workshops, tutoring, editorial policies, and try to, and also, and more importantly, perhaps, try to engage people in the North with the conversation about what do we have to learn from research in the South. For instance, research informality. I mean, most theories about the city do not consider informality, which is, I don't know, a lot of our cities live in informality, and we don't think about it much. We think about it as a dysfunction still, or something that's strange, or is something in the third world, but we don't think about the city or the most important cities as being informal. So I think there's a lot to question ourselves about that. Then another one that's to be critical for me, and it's not in what's normal a consensus about being critical, is what Tuna was saying about relating and learning from other fields, like getting out of the box, getting out of the urban planning research and learn from other disciplines. For instance, for me, it was very interesting to transfer the discussion I was already bored about residential segregation to education and see that I had a case in the university I was working at of a lot of incoming students from being first generation students. And I was like, this is the same that I read about mixed neighborhoods, but in the school. Let's get to read some people in education and make the connections. And I don't know if it's good, but I had a lot of fun and I learned a lot. So I invite you to look at similar areas that are not necessarily urban that may teach you a lot about what you do in urban studies. And finally, for me, being critical means a close relationship between teaching and research, and especially teaching undergraduate students. I was remembering yesterday this phrase of change the world one student at a time. And that's what I try to do, and that makes me the happiest. I think the classroom is a privileged space to practice critical urban research, especially with people not interested in urban research, but that you may get them interested by going to trips, field trips. So this is a group of students. We went to this place, the Bronx, it's called in Bogota, that used to be a very deprived area with a lot of drug consumption and homeless people. And it was part of a renovation project that, in fact, ejected them from there and did very little to recover, reduce the drug consumption or change the drug consumption from a health perspective. So we went there to visit the remains, and we learned a lot from some of the former residents of the place and activists in the center of Bogota. Another day, with a different class, we went to the south of the city and visited the new cable car in Ciudad Bolivar and a block of care that's up. And many of them never went there, only knew stigmatized perceptions of the area, and it meant a lot. And when you see what they say, that was the most important thing in their course, to go there. And so, for instance, Nicolas says the experience of visiting the Bronx was so rich, starting from the way there, walking in a part of the city center that was totally alien to me, was amazing. Then in the exhibition, everything that the local guide said made me reflect about all the ideas that I had about that space. Understanding that in that area, people, kids, the elderly lived, and that even though they were a vulnerable population, they were taken out from their homes and displaced by a state that didn't care about what it was generating. And this is not a sociology student or an urban planning student. And I think we can do a lot doing field trips and teaching undergrads, which is something that sometimes in our careers and in our publication frenesy, we tend to forget. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Maha. We have about 10 minutes for a conversation, then we'll have a 10-minute break and be able to come back for the second session. So if anybody would like to pose questions or comment on these very practical and pragmatic ways of thinking about what it means to actually do critical urban scholarship from 3 excellent examples.
Get us going. I was very intrigued, all 3 of you, wonderful presentations, thank you. Wanted us to you know, think outside of some or ad box, and that's great. Tuna specifically wondered about what that means for your study. So for example, we didn't hear very much about what all these investors are doing. I think sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive, you know, so you talk about international developers who, quite a few in London, are busy building, you know, not affordable, but quite a lot of housing which is of better quality, private rented for patient long-term capital return. So therefore, you know, that's a good example. Think outside of the critical box. You can't say, oh, foreign investors are awful. And I guess in the African context, interestingly, you might look at so-called developmental actors who are coming in large, sort of in great quantity of investment in the name of the Sustainable Development Goals, but may well be bankrupting countries and causing the kinds of investments which lead to perhaps residential environments which are not for the poor, or displacing the poor. So things are not necessarily what they seem. And that seems to ask us really to have some tough theoretical thinking, you know, and to learn from different contexts how to engage with that.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think the answer is in there, what you said, because we can't stereotype what they do. That's why I think my message with my work is that we really have to understand the diversity and actions and characteristics and behavior in a cognitive way, even what investors do and how they think in their choices. Because, like, for example, the difference between investment managers taking over from developers/investors. Investment managers are long-term thinkers. They like to calculate. They like to sit down with municipal authorities, negotiate strategies, and they like regulation and numbers. They want to have certainty. So, of course, for local government actors, for municipalities, it was a kind of discovery to sit down with these less opportunistic type of actors, which also has a big diversity within them, as opposed to classic Dutch developers/investors who are very opportunistic, very short-term thinkers. They don't like strict regulations. They don't want to calculate. They want to see the opportunity and go for it. So I think in our work, what is very important is to, first of all, I think my main problem with critical scholarship, reflecting from my point of view, is that when you do research on property markets, you get this kind of criticism as if you are giving in to the property market actors and their actions. While I'm saying with my research is that we need to understand them so that we can shape, regulate, and stimulate their activity. And they are open to it. Our interviews, our research showed us, I learned a lot from talking to investors and developers myself. I changed my opinion. Of course, stereotypes are there, I have to tell you, that it's still there. But there are those actors who were very interesting. And also, I think to learn about how public sector is thinking in our own field. Like this investor, actually developer, told us, oh yeah, the municipality wanted us to be sustainable because they have sustainability goals. Because the mayor of Amsterdam is about sustainability, it's her target. And what they wanted was wooden kind of walls outside the building to show that it's an ecological building. So they really had to calculate and convince the municipality, this is not going to be very ecological to do that. Yet the manager of the project in planning department was keen on doing that. So all these perceptions, I think, require us to think back, what is public interest? Who are actually safeguarding public interest? That includes ourselves as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to your project on large-scale investors and developmental actors in African cities. And I think my response to your question about thinking outside of the box around investors would be to think about domestic investment. And so the people I've been talking about, they're investing in land and property in the city, but also beyond the city, in other cities and rural areas. And the project I'm just starting now is thinking about local investment in small scale businesses around house building. So I'm kind of interested in the domestic and local scale.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed all three of those presentations. I have a question that was precipitated specifically by Claire's presentation. I don't know who the question is to, though. It's sort of maybe to the room, but Claire, I was really struck by what you said about the role that African studies scholarship has played in your work, and really resonated with me in the sense that South Asian studies has always been a really sort of crucial part of my own work. And I was reflecting on the fact that we're hosted by the LSE's Southeast Asian Studies Centre, right? And so it's a question about the regional, actually. And in the context of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, kind of always seems to me that the sort of urban is registered in a major key and the regional in the sort of minor key. And I just wanted to sort of throw that out there about, how the journal thinks about the kind of articulation of the urban with the regional, how we're all thinking about the role that area studies or regional studies has to play in the role of decentering disciplinary forms of expertise, etc. So I just wanted to sort of, Claire's talk really made me think about that. So I just wanted to...
Would anybody like to take that on? If I can sort of reframe it and direct it to you, Maho, I think from a Latin American studies perspective, I think your research really demonstrates you think across the region and you've done comparative work within the region. And I was having a conversation with Nausheen before about Ananya's concept of strategic essentialisms, the idea of thinking from within specific regions and whether there is sort of a Latin American way to think about social inequality, segregation that can help us think differently. I mean, so centering the region within your own work, or I mean, I was thinking about that in this context, but if anyone wants to take this on,
Yeah, I find it a very interesting point because actually I think region is coming back in our way of thinking the urban. Our research with the investments moving out of the city of Amsterdam was very interesting in a way to see how those very small municipalities are developing new regulations to deal with the market and competing with each other to get investments in their area. And at the same time, investors being fed up with the rigid regulations in the center, getting this relaxed kind of environment. And then, of course, when you look at affordability, housing affordability as a regional problem, you see a very different scale of issues than just looking at the city center. Because in the region, you have other issues. You have social structural issues. You have big resistance from the local communities who don't want urban people coming to their communities. I think there is new research for us waiting for through regional thinking. Yeah.
That's one of the things I've liked about sort of the ambiguity of urban and regional in this sense. It can be regional in terms of the region of the world. It can be understood in terms of urban regions specifically, and we can kind of play with that. I want to put one last question on the table and then we'll have a break. So Johanna.
Thank you. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question. I really liked how all the three presentations gently spoke to each other. And I think what emerges to me out of them that maybe the shift that we're undergoing is a shift from critical theory towards critical theoretical practice. Because and there were many examples that were resonating through all the talks of you. And one part of this practice is definitely trying to read not just Western scholarship, but also go out of the modes of reading and certain styles of writing to read locally. And I want to definitely use this opportunity also to advertise that at IJURR I'm the book review editor, and we now have a new kind of book review. It's called Intraview, which is an English written review of a book that is not written in English. And I will definitely talk to him both about it, but I also want to say it to the whole room that we very much encourage reviewing scholarship that is not available in English and bringing it into our conversation. And the second aspect that really resonated with me, also coming from Eastern Europe originally, I think not only informality can be an asset that we can strategically essentialize and teach to the international academia, but also this more of engagement with things that with institutions that classical critical scholarship consider on the side of enemy, be it the investors or be it the municipality or technocrats. And indeed, I think partly because of less resources and less professionalization, both in Latin America and Eastern Europe, this engagement is more present. Whereas what I've observed here in the global, that is US, UK academia, it is often very, very separate. So yeah.
Anybody like to respond?
Maybe a general kind of comment about practice. What is practice? That was, for me, a very interesting question to reflect on practicing critical scholarship. Because if you think practice as regulating something or developing something, it's different than reflecting on everyday lives of people that we talked about. I think it's a little bit depends on how you describe the practice itself. You can talk about planning practice, but recently I've been working with lawyers, and when we talk about this kind of terms with them, they are very, strict with. They told me, well, there's a difference between law and policy has lots of practice in it. Law doesn't. Law is about theory. So yeah, it's just a reflection, but yeah, I think it's more like a question to all of us. What is practice, actually?
Well, that is a perfect note on which to conclude this meeting. So thank you, Tuna, and thank you, everyone. I apologize for eating into your break a little bit, but Hyun will tell us.
Well, let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 6:38 for the second session.
You're gonna have to ask some time. So let's start here for the second section. It was really great to have the first discussion. I think the question Farid was raising is here yet, but what Farid was raising is really relevant to the second discussion, the issue of urban studies, critical urban studies and area studies. How do you reconcile the two, especially practicing and doing critical urban scholarship from the global south, South Asia, South America, and also Middle East, and myself in the Southeast Asia and East Asia. And also we have Africa expert as well. So the second panel session really brings together these experts and our colleagues who are part of the board members and also incoming editors as well of the journal, who are all based in those regions that we are referring to. So in a sense, this was kind of strategically and intentionally having the speakers brought together to discuss that relationship between critical urban studies and area studies to a large extent. So we had until like 7:45 to have the discussion, and I'll be timekeeping, also trying to be strict with the timekeeping as well. But there's no other way you can actually shut people off. So I chose this kind of way, and I leave it to your ethical consideration. You shut up and then hand over to the next person, right? So we have our first speaker, Mona Fawaz, who is one of our incoming editors, starting from January coming year. And Mona is professor of urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And Mona is co-founder of Beirut Urban Lab, which is a regional research center invested in working towards inclusive, just, and viable cities. And her work spans across urban history, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land, housing, property, and space. Our second speaker is Noshin Anwar, one of our board members, who is professor of city and regional planning in the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, in Pakistan. Noshin is the founder and director of the Karachi Urban Lab, which is an interdisciplinary collaborative platform of research, teaching, mentoring, and advocacy focused on understanding the challenges of urbanization, planning, infrastructure development, and climate change in the global south. Our third speaker is Eduardo Marquez, another incoming editor from January this coming year. He's professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Sao Paulo and researcher and director of the Center for Metropolitan Studies. Eduardo works on urban politics, public policy, social and urban inequalities, and social networks. Tom Goodfellow is professor of urban studies and international development at the University of Sheffield. His work focuses on the political economy of urban development and change in Africa, particularly the politics of urban land and transportation, conflict around infrastructure and housing, and urban institutional change. And Tom is also part of Associate of Urban Institute at Sheffield. And Urban Institute at Sheffield, which was set up by our last but not least speaker, Michele Lancione, who is joining us from Italy via Zoom, is professor of economic and political geography at the Inter-University Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning,
in the Polytechnic of Turin in Italy, and is also a visiting professor of urban studies at the Urban Institute in Sheffield. Together with Abdul-Malik Simon, we currently founded and co-direct the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, and also co-founder and editor of the Radical Housing Journal. And Mikhail is also one of our corresponding editor at IJURR and advisory board member of International Journal of Housing Policy. So what we are trying to have in the second session is a bit more conversational, and each speaker will be given like a 4 to 5 minutes to respond to the first set of questions, after which we also have a second set of questions posed to our panel members to and another 4 to 5 minutes each to respond to the second one. So it's a bit of an artificially intended conversational one, and really see how that goes. I think it will be really nice to actually ask each speaker to reflect upon what it means for them to exercise and to conduct a critical scholarship, and especially what it means for them and for their research and for their organization. So the first set of questions is really this: what aspect of critical scholarship have you or your organization been engaged with, and why is it important for you to engage with that aspect of critical scholarship? So I guess we use that as a starting set of questions and see how that goes. So I suppose Mona, you take the first.
Okay, so the first panel had 20 minutes to talk about how they engage with critical theory. And in 4 minutes, we're going to say where we were, what we've done, and how we engage with critical theory. It's not exactly easy, but I'll take on the provocation. I want to introduce the Beirut Urban Lab, only to say that it's based in Beirut, and I really hope you go on the website and see the work we do. I'll jump immediately into how do we approach this issue of critical theory, or at least how I approach what I call critical urban work in my own work and in the work of the lab. I would say that for me to build critical knowledge is to both interrogate and first to interrogate existing methods, assumptions, categories, vocabularies through which we build urban knowledge, but also beyond interrogation to try and extend existing methods, assumptions, vocabularies that are proposed, and also to propose new ones, because it's very important to go beyond demonstrating the inapplicability of a lot of the categories and ways in which we've built knowledge about our cities, to be able to put forward proposals, ways of thinking that are more productive. And if I wanted to apply this, as you asked me, in 2 minutes to the context and the region where I work, I'll start with only a small piece and with the issue of methods and how I've approached it, but how as a lab we've really approached it. I'll say that we always start, and it's not about being critical as much as it's about being relevant and meaningful. You start with a real problem. You don't start with a disciplinary question. For me, one of the most burning issues that have carried my research for the last 20 years has been the housing crisis, the access to housing, the way in which housing has particularly intersected with property as a colonial legacy, and how that has been exponentially amplified as a crisis with the onslaught of neoliberalism and financialization. So starting from there, I have tried to build layers of knowledge to be able to inform and respond to this question. How is this critical? I mean, what I would say is that none of the classical methods that we use to learn about place can apply to Beirut. We have no state. The international community has gone to the point where they don't even call us a failed state. They say it's a collapsed state. So I can't use citizenship because 20% of Lebanon's population is not Lebanese, less than 10% of Beirut's citizens vote. So if I begin to think of all the categories through which we build that knowledge that we count, it's impossible. Instead, instead I've come to find it very useful to first try to build layers of knowledge collaboratively with anyone that's willing to work with me, and having a lab instead of one person is great. So it's NGOs, sometimes it's a very dissatisfied public actor who is willing to work. And so we finally got a couple of years ago a base map of Beirut. So you can think about this as a big achievement. This allows us to collect further data using some of the contemporary technologies that are actually making it easier for us to know than what would have been possible before, like geographic information systems, relying enormously on visualizations, because they allow us to also engage other colleagues or city dwellers or journalists who would be interested in the conversation and hence in building the knowledge. Ultimately, yes, working with, as colleagues have described them, fragments that are necessarily imperfect, but that allow us in, I think, Jenny, you said tactical methods, and I loved it because I think it's really what it is. It's tactical. It's trying to tactically build that general knowledge that eventually allows us to go beyond, to be engaged social scientists, so to go beyond representing, to also attempt to connect thought to action and disrupt the context in which we are in ways that we imagine are favorable. I'll stop here.
Excellent, thank you.
Very abstract.
Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to be part of these wonderful, very thought-provoking conversations. So my take on critical urban scholarship and interventions. I love Maho's presentation, and a lot of what was on those slides. I was thinking that, wow, this is exactly what I was going to talk about. But so there's a great deal of resonance in terms of what Maho presented. But in a very general sense, it is fundamentally, and the kind of work that my colleagues and I do at the Karachi Urban Lab. Do visit the website if you're interested. We're very tiny, we're very experimental. It's literally just 5 of us, and then we're quite project ridden, although the projects are very interconnected. And so at any point in time, there'll be only 5 of us, and then there might be 20 of us, depending upon the size of the project and the sorts of objectives on hand and our outcomes and so forth. So in a very generalized sense, critical urban scholarship is really thinking about the contextual complexity of a given urban context, sort of trying to get beyond those generalizations in the production of knowledge that comes from the global north, but a kind of a knowledge that is also very strategic and used in the context of the Pakistani state. That's very convenient also for the Pakistani state to use those reductive modes of generalization to think about cities like Karachi. So in our work, we try to sort of go beyond that kind of knowledge that is based on these very top-down, securitized, authoritarian modes of information about the city and the broader region. And I'll bring the region into this for a very specific reason, to think about emancipatory politics, essentially, and what we mean by social justice. Also, the issue today isn't just about social justice, it's also about climate justice. And this regional context is very important because Pakistan has been the ground zero of climate change right now. We went through an incredibly violent moment of climate change over the last 2.5 months. 33 million people impacted through the country, 8 million displaced. Those are the formal numbers. It will be considerably higher. And the 2 regions in the southern part of Pakistan have been impacted the worst. And why? It's a question of geography, it's a question of topography, but also interestingly, colonial legacies of development, of engineering, the engineering of the Indus River, the re-engineering of natural water channels, and so on and so forth, right? Tweaking ecosystems. So what happens in this moment, right? And what is interesting in this moment is that for people like me, we're actually grasping at straws to think about where does critical urban thinking fit into this moment? And actually, you don't have the conceptual frames to even begin to handle a disaster of a problem of this size. So in the context of Karachi, we start slowly, we start excavating, right? We start thinking, well, in this particular moment, how many people have actually come from other parts of Sindh? So Karachi is located in the province of Sindh. Sindh and Balochistan are the 2 regions that have been hit very badly. So we start looking at numbers that come from the Provincial Disaster Management Authority and the Karachi Municipal Corporation. We have a huge problem with data in Pakistan's urban centers. When we go towards Sindh, Karachi and Sindh's other urban centers, and then towards Balochistan, it's slim pickings, it's very anemic. So we rely on whatever's coming out of the PDMA to try and understand, well, how many people have actually gotten into the city. These migrations by default have to happen because most of Sindh is waterlogged. Water is not moving. So people have been displaced, they've been impacted, they've died. There are now issues of disease that are rampant, but the water is not moving. So people come to cities, they come to the city centers to find refuge. Karachi alone, the official data says around 16,000, that's just in the relief camps, but it could be 100,000, or it could be more because there are people coming, their migratory trajectories depend upon social networks, others come to rent, others double up with families. So we've been trying to kind of understand, how do we then apply the knowledge systems that we have in terms of the connections that we make with the local government bureaucracies, provincial management, provincial level bureaucracies to try and generate some kind of data. And this sort of data then dovetails with issues of heat waves, which are rampant in the region now. In Karachi in 2015, or something like 2,000 plus people died because of massive heat waves. So we're looking at, these these interactions. So critical urban scholarship then becomes a sort of a, big question mark, right? How do you generate conceptual frameworks that can deal with these moments that are really, really quite unique and unprecedented? Thank you.
Thank you. Eduardo.
Well, I'm going to start by very briefly presenting the center that I direct. The Center for Metropolitan Studies it was created 20 years ago at the University of São Paulo, and it's sponsored mainly by the São Paulo Research Foundation for PESP, and this is very important to understand, same because it's quite a generous form of funding that is not really common in the South. And we are engaged in scientific production, in research, but also we aim to contribute to public debates and to help policy production, both through aid to civil society actors and organizations and the public sector itself. To give an idea of the size of the center, we have published 67 books in the 20 years, 1/3 abroad, around 700 articles and chapters, more or less half abroad, 80 theses and dissertations, and 40 postdoctoral researches. We have a regular annual program of postdoc that receives postdoc fellows. This is an advertisement for the persons who are interested in São Paulo. And our main focus is on the study of urban inequalities, the reproduction of urban inequalities, and the reduction of urban inequalities through social processes, but also public policies. Mainly in large cities, but not only in cities. And at the moment, we have 11 projects about these themes, about public policies, labor markets, sociability, civil society organizations, associativism, social movements, and things like that. So a defining feature of SAIN is that we do research, but we also do knowledge transference and diffusion. And this is actually, Majo's presentation was really, I almost gave up because she said everything that was what I intended to say. What do you do to contribute to knowledge production and to the changing of the world, which is the idea of critical scholarship, when the academic community is not ready, data is not ready, and public policies must be at the center of the scenario, because you have to make the state do good policies and try to influence the state and state actors to create and disseminate policies that are do some kind of redistribution. So my center is deeply engaged in data production and data dissemination. we at the moment we have 275 databases which are downloaded for free. We offer methods, courses on methods and research training, and we elaborate critical contributions to policy making. I think this is a major part of the center. And this is, at least for the Latin American perspective, is something that is something that I think a center, a critical, a research center associated to critical thinking must do: engage in public policies and in public debates and try to influence what's being done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I should just begin by saying that I'm here to represent kind of multiple collectivities. So as Hyun said, I'm associated with the Urban Institute, as is Michele, but I'm also based in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And I'm also here to talk a little bit about the kind of this idea of Sheffield urbanism, which is a kind of umbrella trying to unite these collectivities and talk about a broader program or mission. But also, of course, most obviously, I'm unlike most others on this panel, I'm not based in the Global South. I'm not in an institution based in the Global South. And I'll come back to that and say some more reflexive things about my role as a Northern and white male scholar working in the South in response to the second round of questions. But at this point, I just want to say a little bit about what people are doing in these institutions. So I'm going to fire quite a lot of information at you about the research going on in the space of critical urban research in the South. So to start with urban studies and planning, the department where I'm based, we have had quite an astonishing transformation. When I arrived there 9 years ago, there were perhaps 2 people working on urban issues in the South. And we now have a whole load of things going on. So to give some examples, we have Paula Meth's work at the intersection of gender, housing and violence in South Africa, India, and now Ethiopia, as well as innovations in qualitative methodology. Melanie Lombard, who's been working to reconceptualize urban territorial conflict, as well as looking at community urban responses to COVID in war-torn areas of Colombia. We've had Zheng Wang working on the long after narratives of urban mega projects in China and the effects of population resettlement. Glyn Williams working on peripheralization and immobility, as well as on localized COVID responses in 3 Indian cities, Ahmedabad, Chennai, and Trivandrum. Philip Horn and Olivia Casagrande have been working on indigenous urban youth and development alternatives in Bolivia. Lindsay Sawyer working on plotting urban land and on tacit governance in Lagos. And bringing a lot of this work together, there's a kind of collective agenda that has become recently quite obvious, even though it's been come to independently, around problematizing and reframing dominant ideas of displacement, urban displacement and resettlement, as well as rethinking urban peripheries. So those are some of the themes that are bringing USP work together. And all of this is embedded in deep international partnerships, and growing those has also been extremely important, including in India, China, Ethiopia, Bolivia, Nigeria, Colombia, Uganda, and South Africa. So I think while we are there in the north doing disparate things, it's really been rooted in 2 principles, one of which is to kind of build these thickening weaves of international partnerships that really become more meaningful over time. And the other is developing early career opportunities for people working on the urban South. This is also an advertisement, thanks. So for example, this year we have joining us Nirali Joshi, who's working on political geographies of human accidents and trauma care in Mumbai's commuter railways. We have Martina Manara, who's joining us from the LSE to look at the de facto regulation of informal land in Dar es Salaam. We have Begonia Aramayona, who is looking at the informal nocturnal city, looking at racialized precarity and moral panic in Southern Europe. And we've also got visiting scholars. At the moment, for example, we have Bazirat Oyalowo from the University of Lagos, who's got an urban studies fellowship to look at how COVID lockdowns realigned trust in communities relative to trust in the state in Nigerian cities. So that's USP. The Urban Institute, which has been mentioned, has really been leading debates in key fields of critical urban scholarship in the South, but also in ways that really challenge the North-South binary. So many of the projects coming out of UI, including Vanessa's here, across both North and South. Hyun has told me to stop. And I know that Michele will speak to a lot of the themes coming out of Urban Institute work. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Michele.
Hello, can you hear me properly?
Just a second.
Can you hear me? Hello?
We're trying to raise the volume so we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Try again.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I'm not there with you. I've just been considerate about the amount of flying that I have been doing of lately, so it's good to see all of you there. So the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, it's very young in comparison to everything that you just presented. We launched the lab in March, and the lab, in a sense, is an expression of a bigger project, an ERC-funded project on inhabiting radical housing. And what we wanted to do with Abdul Malik was to try to find a way to create a sort of an umbrella around the broader interests that are concerning the ERC project. So in a sense, if I have to boil it down to three main concerns, we are looking mainly at notions of housing and housing struggles in particular, so the grassroots side of housing. Not that the policy is not relevant, of course, but we are trying to focus on the grassroots organizing around housing. And in particular, we are trying to find ways of decolonizing the idea of resistance when it comes to housing, because what it looks like resistance from a Western point of view sometimes renders impossible to understand how more mundane forms of resistance come to the fore in other contexts. So housing would be the first main concern. The second concern is related to the urban, and in particular around notions of extensions, notions of logistics, and the ways in which new forms of infrastructures are creating new forms of urbanity. And the two are brought together under the umbrella, which gives the name to the lab of inhabitation. So the concept, the driving idea that we are trying to tackle as a collective is this notion of inhabiting radical housing at the intersection of urbanity and housing struggles. I think, just to give you an idea, the lab is composed by around 12 scholars that are hired through the lab. They are all postdoctoral workers, researchers, and then there is a steering committee of 10 very exciting urban scholars that are coming from very different parts of the world, and there is also a bunch of associates in Turin. I think I just want to say something around the modalities of the work that we are trying to do. For me, one of the most important things in setting up the lab was to try, in a sense, to implement a little bit of a daring approach to hiring processes, so to speak. At least in the context where I am located now, it's not common to see a lab populated by with international researchers. You might have the odd exception, but it's very hard to find a space where people are coming from elsewhere. We don't have the same kind of capacity to attract, so to speak, as other universities located in the UK, in the USA, and so on and so forth. So a huge work went into attracting very talented scholars from the South and other places. The idea with them is to try to use the lab, and this is the subtitle of the lab actually, as a collective study space. What we mean by that, it's really literally about taking some time off in order to study collectively. Now we have a series of extended conversations with our steering committee, engaging conversations that may or may not lead to publications or grant capture. We are really not driven by that. And that's, in a sense, liberatory. And finally, one of the other aims that we are trying to tackle through the lab, that we are trying to achieve, so to speak, through the lab, is to try to create networks with similar kind of labs located in the so-called semi-periphery, if you want, if you allow me that term. So we are establishing a number of partnerships with labs scattered across the globe, thanks mostly to the links that Malik has accrued across the years. And yeah, so and the idea really is to try to bring this together in a series of conversations with us. So I would leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. Well, I guess that takes us to, I mean, you all talked a little bit about the kind of challenges that you face, but it will also be useful maybe to elaborate a little more on those challenges that you face, and also a little more emphasis on what actions you're actually taking going forward, and what have you been implementing to address those challenges, and how do you see the prospect of resolving those issues? So maybe you start with Mona. I see you again.
Well, I mean, I guess what I want to take your earlier provocation to actually answer some of the things I heard that I found super interesting. I was really thinking with the question you've put out, Nushin, on like how can we be relevant in moments like this? And I think I relate very much to being in a context that's transforming in a downward spiral at a very fast pace, where even like the timeline of producing knowledge cannot follow the speed at which things are transforming. And so it becomes a little bit dizzying, and there's an overwhelming sense that you want to be relevant when things are moving so fast that by the time you're about to propose something else has happened. And being able to overlap all these things together becomes very difficult. At the same time, I think that for me, the way to answer this is to try and find where the activists are and what they're trying to do, and how the production of critical knowledge can support and help in some of the arguments they're doing. And so from the beginning, the basis of how I do research starts with finding what activists are trying to do in this city. To just give a very quick example that maybe can help make it a little bit more concrete, there's a huge piece of land on Beirut's seafront that's a beautiful public land that we found out was completely private, and everyone uses it as a common space. And so at some point it was fully fenced, and and activists were desperate when they pulled out the property titles, and they ended up being privately held. And so being able as a scholar to reflect on what does it mean to own and to reclaim through practice as opposed to a title, and being able to then frame this for the activists and bring examples from work that's happening in Latin America about these forms of claims, empowered then an argument and allowed us to allow people to relate to a different form of claiming that space, that where I really felt that like critical theory there was like super useful. I try to do the same with housing and to come to it in multiple ways. Right now, because things are moving so fast, I honestly don't have an answer. So what I've been doing is relying on online platforms where people can put their stories, or because no one knows what to pay for rent, because the Lebanese currency keeps changing all the time, and no one knows what to pay, and things keep changing. We've put online a platform where tenants put what they're renting and how much they're paying. And so by creating a base of knowledge that is fed and informed back by tenants, I'm sure at some point, hopefully, I will have the luxury to sit down and reflect on what this has meant and how it has informed knowledge production. But for now, I feel like some of the tools that we have can start to disrupt, if nothing more. And so I feel that that comes from a place of just really, again, starting with a question that's meaningful to someone other than the discipline. That's been helpful to me. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, so much resonance there in terms of the kinds of things we do. And I think that also speaks to the kinds of cities and spaces that we inhabit, and colonial legacies, state formations, authoritarianism, corruption, although corruption is just not a form of accounting, all of those things that come together in very messy ways. So for myself and my colleagues, one of our sort of, driving sort of obsessions is to engage local and provincial government in the best way possible. Well, there is no local government in Karachi these days. Local government systems have been held in abeyance since for a very long time now. And there's talk of bringing local government back in the context of the kinds of climate disasters that we are seeing unfolding in Karachi, urban flooding, heat waves, and then sort of this cascades outwards towards the entire region. But this is mostly talk. So our only port of call is essentially provincial government, which is a deeply politicized entity, without boring any of you in terms of the kinds of politics involved. So we try. And so typically what we do is that we do generate data, but that data is nothing unless it's contextualized. So whether it relates to urban flooding in terms of how people are impacted, or housing, demolitions, displacements, which have been ongoing for decades, or in terms of heat waves, or what chronic heat means, and how do we think about chronic heat in relation to planning, essentially, right? Thermal violence, planning as a form of thermal violence, in terms of the kinds of built environments that have essentially materialized in places like Karachi over the last many decades, both in a colonial and a post-colonial context. There is a relationship there in terms of the shaping of the built environment. So getting planners, engineers, representatives of government on board in terms of workshops and trainings, and just attending, sort of, come on over, we'll give you tea and cake, and we'll share with you the kind of data that we produced, and we put it out there on our website or any other website, where people might be able to access it. And I think after quite a number of years now, we do get traction. People do come. Bureaucrats especially are increasingly keen in learning about what we do. But then there's also a timeline. Bureaucrats are only there for specific moments in time. So this temporal messiness, these temporal disjunctures also come in the way of how you disseminate knowledge, how far the knowledge actually gains traction and holds on. So we put out those policy briefs, we convert them into Urdu, we try and put them out in other languages also. But again, the challenge for us is, well, to make a difference, how do you sort of keep inserting yourself in these temporal shifts vis-a-vis the politics of the city and national politics? All of it sort of comes together, cascades downwards. But also, I think, again, thinking of Maho's wonderful presentation, also feeding it in terms of teaching and mentoring. I mean, one of the very, very important objectives of Karachi Urban Lab is mentoring a younger generation, a newer generation of students, whether they are in the public university sector university where I work, or graduate students who are interested in the urban. The urban has not been part of the imagination locally speaking in Pakistan. And when the urban is engaged, or when cities are engaged, it's about growth. Sort of, cities as engines of growth, because the broader language is captured by economists and policymakers who are trained in a certain way. So these are some of the challenges that we try to surmount in our own messy ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, trying to continue from exactly the point that you left, I think maybe the task we are trying to do is to engage in critical knowledge production, bypassing the two last elements, the two last problems that Maho said or listed in her list. The fear of a fear of positivism and the fear of technocratic knowledge, trying to contribute to public debates and public policy production, and to not only not giving tools to policies that exist, but advocacy and pressuring for the production of certain policies in a certain way, which is the way of the direction of redistribution, going beyond the idea of positivism and technocratic knowledge. Because you ended with the economists that were also mentioned by Maho. And I think this is an important thing, because the economists actually, they captured completely the discussions on poverty, and with the big data, they will very soon capture all the discussions, because it's only about producing models and running data and producing and producing a theory afterwards, when you have already the results, without discussing this with the history of the disciplines and the theories of the disciplines. So there's a task there, very important task there, to produce knowledge that is connected to the production of better policies, and goes beyond these positivistic or technocratic division, but at the same time grounds the knowledge production and policies in the situations we have in the South, which are deeply heterogeneous, something that is appearing without this name, but actually this is present already in the discussions we are having, that you have different local situations, different academic circles locally. Countries and cities are located differently in the international division of knowledge production. And also, they have different colonial residues that you mentioned before, which is, the residues are completely different in Latin America than they are in Africa or the Middle East.
Thank you. Tom. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, if I'd left myself more time to talk about the Urban Institute, I wanted to mention a wonderful talk we had from Beth Perry, the director, just 2 days ago on co-production, where she talked about this idea of epistemological choreography, like how do we assemble different kinds of knowledge? And this is a challenge I particularly want to focus on, is like in the sense of what is the role of the Northern researcher in the Southern city. Now, of course, it would be disingenuous to pretend that our understanding about having changed and changed for the better, in the sense that there are far more opportunities for Southern researchers to gain funding to do research in their own cities. More and more urban scholars are coming through. There's a greater awareness of publication challenges, as Claire has mentioned. So I want to think a bit about what this means. And in a sense, what is one supposed to do as a Northern urban scholar in these circumstances? You could just carry on as before, as if nothing's changed, and I don't think that's appropriate. You could find yourself in the role as a sort of manager or administrator of research that others are doing, and many of us do. But that's also not, that's not really decolonial, is it? That's not satisfactory either. Equally, to become the kind of income capture person who gets the grants and other people do the research seems problematic in other ways. So you could sit back altogether and simply learn, and of course that's valuable, but then the question is, what do you do with that knowledge? So this is something I've been thinking about a lot, as I'm sure a lot of other scholars working in the South have been, I would hope. And I just want to mention 3, I don't know, principles perhaps that have come to mind based on my own experience of research and of building partnerships. And one is this idea of retemporalizing, thinking differently about the timelines and timescales of research. You know, in my early research, I remember a guy in Uganda saying to me when I was like pacing around trying to find a document of some kind, you need to be a little bit patient, sir. And I was like, I kind of realized, okay. But this is not to say necessarily that things are slower, because actually, if some green light comes on, things can move incredibly fast in terms of research in the South. Now, I've been amazed by, for example, Taibat Lawanson, running a work package in a big project where they delivered a very complex package of research extremely quickly in Nigerian cities in very challenging circumstances. So I think it's this idea that you need to have a kind of perceptual shift in temporality, right? And dislocate our understandings of the timeline of research so that we can do it in a way that has maximum benefit in that context. Second point is an idea of decartography, okay? And I would say that as distinct from the idea of countercartography, of using maps to challenge power. It's the idea of perhaps rejecting maps, because I'm always struck in many Southern cities by people's sometimes fear of maps. We did some mapping interviews in a recent workshop, and some people were really scared. They were like, I don't understand where things are on the map. I don't want to participate in this exercise. And I think that's really important. In some places, to talk about sloping up or down, or moving towards or away, is more important than saying north, south, or left or right. And it's also perhaps the idea that maybe you don't need to go somewhere when you think you need to. Your understanding of spatiality, it's taken me a long time to realize how colonial and in a sense northern my understanding and use of maps is. And I think that's something that you can learn to challenge productively in these Southern partnerships. And thirdly, and I guess related is to kind of, to be the periphery, to peripheralize yourself in a project, in a way perhaps a bit like Jenny's provincialize, as a Northern researcher, but also to show your hand, you know, not to pretend that you don't know anything or you don't have any power, to lead when appropriate, but then also to be led. Beth reminded us in her talk of a maxim, I think it's from Bertrand Russell, this idea that dogmatism and skepticism are 2 sides of the same coin. The idea that you think you know everything and the idea that you think you know nothing. You know, these are both very problematic. And actually, of course, not only do we not know everything as urban researchers from anywhere, but also we don't know nothing, right? And so pretending not to know things, you know, is a reflection of privilege sometimes, and it can corrupt the research process as much as thinking we know everything. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Last but not least, Michele.
Sure, thank you, Hung. So in terms of challenges, when we think about the political, we are now living in a moment here in Italy that you know all about. So the country has gone extremely far right, and one of the key challenges surrounds the notion of the military. And I think we're going to see very soon an increased militarization of the country. So what is the role that this kind of lab can play? I think we have already taken a number of public stances against the ways in which our polytechnic is engaged in that kind of industry. So that is, in a sense, the first working internally to try in the minor, so to speak, to fight some of these tendencies. So that is definitely one of the areas. And the other one, the one that is really of deep concern to me and also to Malik, is to try to use the space of the lab, the resources of the lab, not really to speak to Italian policymakers. This is not what we want to do. What we want to do is to create a space where a number of academics that may not have this opportunity in their own context can come and find, so to speak, the tools and the capacity to nurture their intellectual ambitions and their political ambitions. Just to give a couple of examples, we have spent an incredible amount of time and resources to try to support a number of competitive applications. So now, in less than 6 months, we already acquired 2 excellent Marie Curie scholars and Urban Studies Foundation scholars that are coming from the South. And the idea is to allow them to leave this semi-peripheral space that doesn't have the pressure that comes with academia in the UK, for instance, that I know well, to develop and to keep, so to speak, to develop the critical edge, the critical scholarship. So to use the lab in a sense as a space that can nurture this kind of work also. And here I really hear, and I'm really inspired by the work of Mona, for instance, but also Noshin, to do this kind of work with activists as well. We are going to launch very soon an activist in residence program in order to do the same work with activists that usually don't have the time and the luxury actually of taking time off their activities in order to pause, study, and engage with others. And so we're going to offer a little bit of time for them, and we're going to select people on the basis of the work that our researchers are already doing in their own contexts, for instance, in Brazil, in India, in Nigeria. So we really to use the lab in a sense as a space, as a safe space in order to nurture the capacity of others to do some of the political work that you have already talked about.
Thank you so much. IJURR has been was established 45 years ago, and 1977 was the first year of producing volume 1. And we do have the pleasure actually on our Zoom where among the Zoom attendees, 2 of the founding members of IJURR who have joined us, including the founding editor, Michael Harrow, who is also here right in the Zoom. So I think it will be nice actually to hear from them, and I would ask them to be concise, by the way, even though you don't have many minutes remaining. Starting with Enzo Mingione, who is one of the founding members of IJURR, who is currently a professor of sociology at the University of Milano, Bicocca, and he was dean of faculty of sociology at the University of Milano, in the same university, and also from 2004 to 2010, having taught at the universities of Messina and Padua. And to Andrew and Michael, really the question we ask you to very concisely respond is really, what was your initial thought of critical urban scholarship when you were founding the journal, and what will be your kind of response to various challenges that you were just sharing that were affecting the global south now that you are 45 years after the publication of the journal? I'm asking you too many things, big questions that make it into, and probably not doing justice to you. Or can you just make it like a few minutes of intervention to respond to that? Andrew, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Very good. Well, when we started and when we started the journal, we were a group of radical thinkers, mainly from Europe, very little from the United States, and radical Marxist and radical Weberian. Some of us were also some sort of connected to the urban social movement that at the time were flourishing, and I remember I had experience in this sense. And we, at the beginning, we were not so much attentive to the other part of the world and to the global south. I am quite impressed by the debate today, and I'm very happy about it. I'm very pleased because in a way, we started to be conscious of the fact that the world was much larger than only Europe, and we began, particularly when we founded the foundation, the IJURR Foundation, we began to think of how to open up to some sort of radical urban studies and to radical urban scholars attentive to the development of urbanization also in the global south, and in any case to be attentive to some sort of the change that were taking place everywhere in the world. I think you said at the beginning that there is still a lot of work to do to enlarge properly, but I think we have gone through the debate today show that we have gone towards the right direction. There is still something to do to increase our attention in these difficult time, very difficult times. And Italy is, as it has just been said, Italy is one of the places where the situation is becoming very difficult, but other are also somehow places where some sort of a commitment towards the struggling against the inequalities in poverty, some sort of the new problems of urbanization are important. I think the journal has kept through some sort of 40 and more years some sort of this end, which is very, very important. And I think we have to try to maintain it in the future and to develop it further in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We now have Michael Harlow, or maybe he's not connected. Oh, right. So I guess the time was a bit late, but it was really pleasant to hear from Enzo. Thanks so much, Enzo, for your thoughts. Michael Harlow, who I had a chance to meet a couple of days ago in a separate event, was really speaking very enthusiastically about today's event. So I guess that kind of gives us a bit of time, but I know Mona was desperate to actually have one additional comment.
Yeah, do you mind? I kind of wanted to answer this issue of studying somewhere else. And I think it's important maybe to think about the fact that when you're studying somewhere else, it's not necessarily that the pace is slower, but that what maybe would you call the space of difference, the difference between you and that other context is big enough so that you have to spend more time in order to understand better, to be able to get insights into that context that you're trying to study. And I think that matters a lot, because otherwise I was a little bit struck by that issue of the map and people being afraid of the map. I think if you went to a neighborhood in London where there's a threat of this imminent displacement because there's a redevelopment and you held the map, I would be shocked if people were not frightened to death by the map as well. The map carries images of planning that I would assume are in this day and age, sadly, universally scary to everyone. So I guess I think that's, for me, that was important to reconsider, because we have seen fantastic work from scholars from one place to the other. And sometimes these cross gazes actually help us see things differently. Currently, like when I'm thinking about Beirut, honestly, the city that helps me the best understand where works about this city are helping me understand best Beirut is Detroit. I don't know if you want to call it Global South, Global North, but the work that's coming out of Detroit about ruination and abandonment is is creating the vocabulary that's very much more useful to me than the vocabulary of Latin America, for example. So,
Yeah. I mean, do you want to? I can respond to that. Yeah. No, I mean, I totally agree, and I certainly didn't want to imply that like research is necessarily slower, but I feel like our expectations are like we have this kind of thing. This is the length of the research project. This is when the pre-op work will happen. This is when the writing up will happen. I think those are constantly challenged both by the institutional and infrastructure constraints. I mean.
It's on your timeline.
But in different ways. Like, so on this other project I'm working on, they've done the research way earlier than I expected. I was like, oh, this is supposed to go through a year too. And it was done but that understanding that and working with that is very important. And it's actually takes a bit of a shift. So in a way, it's not so much, I totally agree about studying elsewhere. And of course, all of my research has been from that perspective of being the outsider and that being a kind of justification for the value of it, because there is that value of the outsider and you learn from juxtaposition. When I arrived in Sheffield, there were all these echoes of Kampala, right? Not just in the topography, but in the way the city and nature and post-industrial spaces came together. But I think as a global northern scholar, as a white male scholar in a colonial metropole, one also has to recognize something different. It's not just any elsewhere to elsewhere.
But Nushin has one comment to make, and after Nushin, perhaps you can collect some questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, I had a very, very quick comment, sort of just based on what Mona was talking about, this question of the South. You know, Lisa and I were discussing this earlier, and thinking about what it means to do research from the South and sort of seeing the South as some kind of a category that might give us some kind of conceptual anchor has become deeply problematic for me. And I mean, I actually find that perhaps it is time to jettison this idea of something unique about the South. And I'll just very, very quickly sort of give you an example why it's become problematic for me. So I work on heat, on chronic heat, and I look at heat waves. And in the particular context of the kind of planetary turbulence that we are going through, the question of global warming and heat waves is now global. And we're seeing evidence of that, right? Time and time again. This has been the hottest October in Europe, in the UK. And so when I think about questions of thermal violence and thermal inequality, which are tied to issues of informality and housing and urban planning in the global South, these are also very pertinent now in the global North, right? When I consider, you know, London councils like Newham, Islington, which are very deprived councils with degraded housing stock, private rental sector issues, and migrants and asylum seekers and ethnic minorities stuck in that, and you know, the heat risks. So where do we situate ourselves in terms of these binaries that are by definition unstable, essentially? So I think that critical urban scholarship, perhaps it's time to also reconsider the meanings and perhaps do what Lisa suggested, which is let's go back and think about strategic essentialism, which might be a more productive way of thinking about the North and South.
Well, coincidentally, some of the colleagues who are in this room were seeing their trains cancelled today because of heavy rain last night. So infrastructure problems are not just something of the global South. So we have questions maybe some questions. You can have probably about 10 minutes and 10 to 15 minutes max to have some questions from the audience. There was a question on Zoom. So we are about the asking the question of urban theories being taught being no longer relevant. But I think this question has been more or less addressed during the conversation. So I guess we'll move on to. But thanks so much, Sylvia, for that question. But we'll move on to some more questions from the audience or from other people on the Zoom if you have questions to post. So can you just introduce who you are, by the way, briefly?
Don't remember me anymore?
this.
I'm Mara. Thanks a lot for a great set of conversations. I mean, it's a question, but it's also a comment. So it's one of those. Because there was a discussion about regions, right? And this idea of this sort of space as a kind of category for us to think about. But the discussion about data made me think about time and the context of the time we live in. Because the idea that we fear positivistic and technocratic kind of types of data might be sort of at odds with the types of states that we have nowadays that don't want to see things, right? So I'm thinking about sort of James Scott, kind of seen like a state. We have states that don't want to see. So Brazil, for instance, has a census that was supposed to be released already, but it didn't happen. And I heard from a colleague that India is in the same situation. The Brazilian president fired the guy from the forestation sort of institute because he didn't want to see data about deforestation. The data about COVID deaths was out at some point because he didn't want people to see data. So I just want us, I mean, perhaps it's a topic of conversation, how, making visible through data realities that states don't want to see might be a powerful sort of critical practice to recover some of the conversations that happen in a time where, data is critical in a way. So, yeah.
Mara Nogueira, former PhD and current lecturer in Perfect Geography. Yeah. Thank you.
You remember this.
Any further? I think there was nice kind of comment and nice suggestion to take. Can you have any other questions? So let's have one over there, another one here. And if we have time, we can take one or two more.
Yeah, thanks very much for the interesting conversation. I'm actually quite intrigued by this idea. Oh, Jonathan Rock, University of Kent. Yeah, so thanks everyone. It's really an interesting discussion. This idea of using urban vocabulary, I think, is very important for this discussion. And I'm wondering, this idea that we're lending vocabulary from certain cities to look at other cities is something I'm quite intrigued by. And I'm wondering how that would be applied across different contexts and how we could do that more productively, especially using vocabulary from the global south, something that we're not doing enough in these conversations.
Shall we take one or two more?
Hi everyone, my name is Catalina Ortiz from UCL. So I've been enjoying a lot of this discussion, but I was going back to the title of the whole event, and it's about decentering. So I was wondering to what extent you are explaining, and conceptualizing that decentering. We've been listening a lot about beyond theory, beyond discipline, beyond binaries, beyond. Is it decentering just going beyond and bringing, people from, other places, or how are you conceptualizing decentering?
Good question, which is a question, I guess, and at the board meeting we'll be engaging over the next 2 days, actually. But any one more, perhaps? Jenny?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm struck by the presentations here, pointing us towards also the earlier presentations, a kind of infrastructure of the labors that we're involved in as critical scholars, which are infrastructures we've heard very practical. Working with communities, producing knowledge in a very heated or particular context, knowledge which is not an academic paper, which may never see the light of day anyway in your own academic papers because you're so busy doing community work. So how, and then the other side of it is hinted at in Tom's presentation, which is many fantastic urban scholars around the world are doing much more than just that, but actually contributing to policy, being very active, having very challenging lives, and so on. So are not, their work is not being translated into circulating narratives and academic writing. And I think this is one of the problems that decentering needs to address, which is, it's a challenge for IJURR, for us in northern or well-resourced institutes anywhere. How do we transform what we're writing? And I think I was very intrigued by Enzo's comments there. I think when these Patrick Legadius courses, Young Turks, jumped up and started the IJURR, there were a number of people who were already quite committed and engaged across different Global South contexts, David Slater, Walton, Castells, etc., as well as people working from other contexts, quite a lot of publications at that time, including efforts to publish work that was practice-based. There's been an ongoing project of IJURR, which Liza has been pushing as well. So I think in that infrastructural zone of these different kinds of practices that you're discussing is a potential agenda for transforming what we publish and what constitutes knowledge and the ethics of publishing that knowledge. What kinds of formats have you been experimenting with? What suggestions do you have that perhaps IJURR and other journals could take up? So that's the question.
Well, those are very good questions. Maybe we start with, if it's okay, Michele, and maybe we start with you, since we always kind of having you as at the last to make the last contribution. So maybe you kind of reverse the order and start with Michele and let our speakers to respond to any of these questions in whichever way you'd like to.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, great set of questions. I mean, when I hear about the question on decentering, my immediate response is decentering what in respect to what. No, that is very important. It's because it's a situated question. For me, in Italy, in Turin, decentering means to an extent to decenter the ways in which urban studies has been taught in Italy for a very long time, and very policy driven, very inward looking. And a way of doing that decentering is bringing in people that have completely different kind of approaches. So physically creating opportunity. So to an extent, it's about that. And then the larger question on speaking about journals, speaking about IJURR, as it was reminded before, I'm one of the founder of the Radical Housing Journal, and I really believe in a form of decentering that it's also about caring about the craft of writing, which is something that is very hard to do, and the Radical Housing Journal, we spend a lot of time to do that. What I mean by that is that many authors coming from the semi-periphery, the South, whatever you want to call it, have not been trained in writing in the ways in which usually content is published in IJURR or in other journals, Anglophone journals. So like spending literally time to try to allow these scholars to communicate. It's not just a linguistic problem. We all know that it's way more than that. But doing this kind of nitty-gritty commenting and feedbacking and coming back to it. Lindsay Sawyer at Sheffield has done an amazing British Academy program with Taibat Lowenson in Lagos precisely around this, with early career scholars coming from Nigeria. And that is a work that I think a journal like IJURR could do, and I'm calling myself into it, like editors could and should do more of that kind of work. That is a part of decentering, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of the panelists in the room?
Sure, I can say a couple of, oh, go ahead.
Maybe
I haven't shut up.
Eduardo, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to mix all the questions together. I would start with the idea of conceptualizing decentering. I would say that there are two dangers. Well, the greatest challenge to incorporate the production or knowledge production from the South, and I would put quotes because South is already, as already mentioned, very heterogeneous, is to incorporate visions, contributions, and offers, and not just cases, not just empirical realities. And this has to do with the incorporation of authorship and of the ideas, the theories being produced there. And this leads me to do two challenges, well, which are, I think, deeply entrenched in the South, at least in my South, and they are twins. The first one is parochialism, provincialism, the idea that what we do is really different and absolutely incomparable with other places, and we have a Brazilian political theory, for example. There are persons who use this. And compare Brazilian political theory or Brazilian sociological theory. And so this is one danger. The other danger, which is similar, actually, it's the same thing, but the other way around, is too much deference to the ideas and theories that are produced abroad. So we have been consuming for decades knowledge, offers, theories produced elsewhere, and the ideas become out of their place, disconnected. So what we need to get around these two problems is to create a vocabulary that travels. A vocabulary that travels and respects the heterogeneity of the situations in the South and in the North. Because if we want to do theory, you have to have something that covers the whole variation of the phenomenon, not just one theory for the South and one theory for the North. Or since the theories were produced from the North, now we produce theories from the South. Doesn't work. We have to have keywords, maybe a strategy of concepts that are grounded enough in empirical realities, that dialogue empirically with the different situations in different places. And I believe these concepts, the better concepts for that, are the concepts which are not very abstract, because the abstract ones give you an idea or an illusion that they can travel very fast, but at the same time they travel, but they do not ground in the places, and you end up with doing something that is not really does not account for the variation of situations that you have in this heterogeneous South. Data, sorry. Data. First, the ex-president. Or if you want, the incumbent. But data, for data, I think the same thing I said also refers to data, because data is situated knowledge. So it has to be included from the lens of the theories and the knowledge that produces and that chooses variables, chooses ways of representation or things like that. So it's exactly the same problem.
Is there still time?
I guess we probably need to wrap up, but why don't everyone just give a brief a response to these important questions?
Just quickly respond, which I think touches a few questions, which again, it's another shout out for Lindsay Sawyer actually, which is I urge people to read an editorial she wrote this week for City, the journal, where she talks about how Northern scholars, this speaks to the issue of vocabulary, right, get a lot of kudos for using words from the context they study. It shows their local knowledge, they're using the vocabulary that's local, while Southern scholars are often told not to use colloquial language and penalized for not using the kind of language expected of journals. And that, I think that throws down a real challenge for how we think about knowledge production, where it applies to and from, and touches on some of those bigger issues of how do we decenter when we have such an infrastructure of academic gatekeeping that is beyond individual people that needs to change.
Yes, for that, with the editorial in the City journal.
City, yeah. Sorry, different journal.
We love to work together.
I mean, there's not enough time to say everything. I think I take in a lot of the comments and they're great, but just to give one example of a vocabulary, because I use that word that I have found incredibly interesting and productive. It's the term informality, very simply, that has been used and misused maybe in 100 different ways, but has responded from the beginning to a need that I think in the beginning planners had to explain a reality that didn't conform to how they thought the word should run. And then eventually was reappropriated and really used as a lens in many ways to explain things in different places. So I think sometimes concepts and put intention in different geographies allow us also to be able to see things that we otherwise don't see. But I also take very seriously the provocation of how do we write about all these other experiences beyond reflexively, right? Which we do. I think one of the main difficulty is that when you're going to write an academic article, no matter how much we're going to help someone in English,
the conversation is happening in English. The theorization, the references are actually in English. And those of us who are in institutions in the South that aspire to be in the North are promoted for publishing in academically refereed journals in the North. So we have to be in conversation in English with these scholars. And it's very hard to bring other scholars in this conversation. So I think thinking about other ways of writing, or how do you expand canons when perhaps some of what we're doing is inherently coming from an English writing tradition. I think I wouldn't, it's important to how people frame the arguments, but it's not just the framing of how we write. There's more than that.
Gosh, I think everyone has said what needs to be said. Maybe in terms of one last comment on decentering. I think sort of where I'm situated in the context of Pakistan. So my colleagues and I work on Karachi, but also we work more broadly on Sindh. And in terms of Pakistan's politics and its history, these are the regions that have been least on the radar, even in terms of, sort of Pakistani politics. It's really more about Punjabi hegemony and domination and those sorts of things. So decentering is also in terms of where you're working from, right? Your positionality, the geography that you're located in, and how you sort of scale that up into what you produce and whom you write with, and the activists and NGOs and community partners that you connect with across the city and across the region. So I just want to end it there. Thank you.
Well, we started this session by me kind of making a comment on the current scholarship of IJURR, where I was kind of saying that we do have a less presence of the papers and authors who work on the global south. And I think, going back to Catalina's question, and Catalina, by the way, one of our new corresponding editors of the journal, it doesn't necessarily mean we increase the number of those papers, number of authors. I think that when the quantity is obviously one thing we need to work with, but it's also probably not something to be taken to be equal to kind of tokenistic decentering. As what Leo Musavi, who has this very wonderful paper, Leo Musavi from Singapore, on decolonization, what he has written about, and I think that's a really important point to take away. Also, going back to what Eduardo was talking about, this issue of, and also probably Carlos Baena was also saying something to do with the kind of epistemological chauvinism or nationalism, also to be cautious about, to stay away from that aspect. And I think it's also probably important to ask the positionality to all those who are working in established institutions, either in the global north or also in the global south. And because paying more attention and working with global south and strengthening the scholarship in global south, it leads to another kind of reproduction of the power relations and hierarchical situations where the global south institutions become position themselves at the apex of these power relations. I think that's also probably not the kind of wanted way or kind of good way of going for decentering decolonization. So I think that's also something we need to work with. And equally, the question needs to be asked to IJURR on the similar journals, how much we actually do, whether it actually produces the consolidation of existing hierarchical and power relations that we have been enjoying. And I think there's a constant questioning that needs to be asked to a journal like IJURR. And I guess that's where we are trying to heading to. So with that in mind, let me thank all our panelists, including Mikali on Zoom and those in the room in person, all of you who have joined us via Zoom and also in person staying with us until 8 o'clock. Really appreciate this. And I hope we are all kind of working together in coming months and years to reach the goal that we wanted. So thanks so much, everyone. Thank you very much.